Welcome to the Beza Performance live stream. My name is Marshall Henley, and today is S&OP Thursday, where I welcome once again Doug Dedman of DBM Systems. Doug, welcome aboard.
Oh, good to be here, Marshall.
Today is required data. It's part 7 of our What Does Good Look Like series. So why don't you tee that up for us?
Yeah, and maybe if you just share my screen for a second, Marshall, maybe to
Sure.
put a little bit of context. I think the point that the stuff that we've been working through, really is these the kind of 8 areas of what does good look like. And yeah, so today we want to talk about supporting data, and I kind of put this in this spot just from a logical standpoint, because we've really gone through a lot of stuff around how do you structure your families and all of that sort of stuff. But then really the question is, what do you actually use? What data do you actually use in your S&OP process?
Yeah.
And really, what should you expect in terms of using that data? So I thought that would be a good spot to maybe chat about that for a little bit with everyone. And the other part of that context that we've been working through is, when we talk about what does good look like, we think about, and it's been focused on the executive S&OP process. And so it's really the question of how well is the executive process working, and some of the measurements of the things that we've focused on is your executive S&OP meeting a report out or a decision making meeting? Is it? Can you get through the entire business in 1 to 1.5 hours? And does everyone walk out of the executive S&OP meeting on the same page and ready to execute the plan? And the final and probably most important one on that is the senior executive engaged in the meeting. And so today, what is the role of data in getting these things to happen? That's really what we want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I would remind folks that this is the second to last part of a 9-part, or pardon me, an 8-part series called What Does Good Look Like? And we've got an assessment, and you can go and use the assessment for free at basaperformance.com, or you can also look at it on dbmsys.com. It's available in both places. It'll give you a very long PDF that's got very precise and prescriptions of what you should consider, changing and prioritizing what those changes might be to your process. So
yeah. Well, and I think it's important. When we talk about the data today, is to think about what are some guidelines around the data. So, like, what guidelines on how you should collect or what you should expect on that side, and then probably spend a bit more time on the purpose. Like, what really should you look at for the purpose side of things. So maybe if you pull up my screen, Marshall, that'd be great, and then we can chat through these. So I think the first one, and this may be obvious to some people, is that the S&OP process needs to be data supported. So, it's not, it can be a bit of an emotional process sometimes, and people get emotionally engaged in it or not sometimes. But the whole thing about it is you want to be supported by data. We're making decisions using data as the inputs to that. The second thing about that is the current or your actual data. So and I'll talk about the specifics around actual data versus forecast data, but your actual data should come from your ERP system. In other words, you don't want to necessarily be making that up or putting, hey, how do we hope things are going to look? It really should be the actual data that's coming out of your ERP system. And the other part of that is the data has to be normalized across sales and operations. And this goes back to some things that we talked about, in that the family needs to be normalized so that we can actually balance the plan between the demand side and the supply side. So it's got to be in the same periods. It's got to be in the same unit of measure. So if operations is thinking about things in fiscal periods, but then sales is putting all the data kind of on a calendar periods, that doesn't work, right? Like, the
right.
things need to sync up, because we're really looking for a plan that's balanced and actionable.
And to that end, we would remind folks that the unit can't be dollars, because in almost any environment, dollars won't give you an actionable plan because of heterogeneous pricing.
Yep. 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 Absolutely. And the final point on the guidelines. So I talked about actuals, like, so, what's happened, but then it's the forward looking plan. So whatever you're doing in terms of, I like to use plan and not forecast. And I think we've talked about that several times, right,
Right.
Marshall? But like that forward looking plan, whether it's the build plan or whether it's the buy or the sale plan, that actually needs to then turn around out of your S&OP process and be linked back to your ERP system, because it's got to drive those forward activities. So if I'm thinking about my supply chain and the cumulative supply chain lead time, I really want to be driving that forward-looking plan back, so that at least I'm really closing the loop on this.
So we say ERP, but of course we also work with a lot of lean companies. Beza is actually a lean practitioner, so it drives your Kanban sizings, whatever you're using for the production planning, component.
Yeah.
That's the idea there, but it's
Well,
got to go back into that as an
yeah, and
executable
I
item.
mean, I use ERP because regardless, I don't know any companies now that aren't running some sort of
Yeah,
enterprise requirements plan. They may not be running MRP, but
right.
everybody's doing something. And so those execution things are tied to your purchase orders, because hopefully you're paying your vendors, or they're not going to be vendors
Right.
for very long.
Yeah. For those, I say that always for those who are really allergic to any sort of push
Yeah, yeah,
terminology,
no,
versus
that's
pull,
true.
but
It's a good
we know what you mean.
it's a good point. It's a good point. Point well taken. How's that? So that's a bit of the guidelines side of it, and then I really want to make kind of 3 points of the purpose of data, and I think that's the balance of what I wouldn't mind talking about today. And
Okay.
and really those 3 points are, they need to tell the story and balance the plan. They need to support accountability across the organization. So the data needs to tell the story, balance the plan. It needs to support accountability, and it needs to support your risk assessment. Because if I think about how we're engaging with, the people within the organization, right? So like the executives and the people that own, and have accountability for the demand plan and the supply plan. These are really important things, right? The data's got to be at a level in a way that it tells a story, right? So that, hey, this is A, where we are, and B, where we want to get to,
And
right?
if we want to change that,
And
what do
right,
we have to change?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And then it's got to support the accountability for getting from A to B. And then that risk assessment of, well, is that plan actually, do we actually have a chance of getting there, right? So that risk assessment's got to be part of it. So I'll spend a little bit of time on those three things, just so
Okay.
that we can go through. So, um, as you, no surprise to you, Marshall, I'm going to come back to the 5 section sheet, right? So this whole idea, when I talk about telling the story, right, we're really talking about, the 5 section sheet here, right? And so on that 5 section sheet, to put this story together, I've got the first section, which is my bookings, and that's my order inflow. So when I think about the story, that order inflow is the forward-looking plan of what we think is we're going to take for orders in the month that we're going to take them. So if I look at this one, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to take 1,300 units approximately in the next month, and then going forward, as well as what we've done in the past, as well as what did we call last change. So I've got my order inflow as part of my story. The next thing I've got is my shipments or my order outflow, right? So I've got order inflow, the orders that we're going to take, and the shipments are what we're shipping out, right? So this order inflow increases my open orders or increases my backlog. My shipments decrease my backlog, and I've got the same thing. What have we done? And what's going to happen? What are we planning going forward? And those two are typically linked, right? We can't ship something if we don't have an order, and so it's pretty important to have those linked. The delta between those, and one of our buffers that we manage, is our backlog, right? And so when we look at that, is what's our current total backlog, and then what is our backlog going forward, which we can easily calculate, because I know I'm planning on taking X amount of orders. I'm shipping X amount of orders. So my previous backlog plus my orders minus my shipments is my forward-looking backlog. So I get a story of, is backlog expected to increase or is it expected to decrease? And I'll pause for a second there, Marshall, because I know I use the word backlog, and some people, oh, backlog, that's all bad. It's stuff in the past. When I look at backlog, I'm actually talking about the whole horizon of open orders, right? And so if I'm sitting here today, there's bad backlog, which is in the past. Hopefully that works if I do this on the screen and it's not going the wrong way, but left for me is in the past and right is going forward. And so backlog in the past is bad. Backlog going forward is good, right? And that total backlog is the thing that will indicate what your lead times are, right? Simple example, if I'm shipping in the example that you've got up here, it's roughly, I'm going to say, let's just say for average sake, it's 4,000 units a month. And if I've got 22,000 units in my backlog at the end of this period, I've got approximately 4 months of lead time. And so part of that story, that data actually tells us, and that's all data that you have in your ERP system today.
So right? The only other, maybe to find a point I'd put on that is the backlog in the future is good because those are orders that you're going to be able to realize as income, but that's assuming that you're delivering to customer expected lead times or customer promised lead times. So obviously, if you have a big delta between requested and promised, that could be bad, but not bad in the context of what we're talking about here. Just bad, something you might work on, reducing lead times by increasing supply or something, building inventory, whatever you're going to do to fix that problem. But
what I find quite interesting is often when we first gather the data out of the system and we put it out there and we put it in front of people, is the epiphany that happens when I look at this forward-looking backlog, right? Because often we're not looking at it, right? And if I've got 22,000 units in backlog and I'm only shipping 4,000 units a month, right? I basically have 5 months of backlog, actually. Boy, I can't do the math. Four times 4 would be 16,000, but 4 times 5, just to use a rough number, right? Yeah. So, just litmus test says that's where I am today. And that's one of the important things about data this is not about hiding anything. This is about acknowledging where we are today. Remember I said we're here at A and we want to get to B. Well, something has to change, right? Yes. If I'm sitting there with that amount of backlog, right? I've got 22,000 units in backlog and I'm shipping roughly 4,000 a month. I have really two choices, right? I can start taking a lot less orders, right? And still continue to ship 4,000 units a month. And that will start to reduce. So if I'm shipping 4,000 every month, I'm reducing my backlog, right?
Yeah.
That's usually not a great plan for businesses, right? Where I'm going to, that's how I want to deal with my backlog. So then I got to deal with, okay, well, how am I going to reduce that? Well, I've got to then balance that back to the production side of things to say, we might be balanced today at the 4,000 units of production and 4,000 units of shipments, but that's not going to, that's not going to solve your problem. And that's why, and I know I cut it off after like 3 months, but that's why that data telling a story is just so darn important, right? Because I have to acknowledge, okay, as I look forward, am I actually driving production up enough? Because by the way, if I don't drive the production up and we go to the other parts of the family, we're going to see that if I don't drive the production up, my inventory is going to go into negative, which we've said it many times, that's virtually impossible.
And just as another point of emphasis, it's not just that we want to see that, we want to see it in the same place so we can see the balancing between the different, flows of what's going on. So that's why the 5-section sheet isn't 5 separate sheets that we look at independently. That's actually a flaw, we think, in many people's S&OP process, because they don't see that part of the story, how stuff's flowing into the backlog, and what are we going to do about it in the future plan. And that I think is one of the brilliant pieces of what the 5-section sheet really represents is seeing that all together. So,
well, yeah, and it's the biggest thing that we notice when we start working with people is they do all the sales stuff, so everything that's up here, right? And then they flip over to the supply side, and then it's real hard to connect the two. So this story that we're talking about is that balance story, which is a great segue. Thanks, Marshall, to my next part here, which is really talking about production, right? So that is my production line. So in order for me to ship it, I've actually got to also produce it, right? And so I've got production, but part of that production is what is my capability. Another really important step in here is, much like I can't ship it if I don't have the orders, I can't produce it if it's above my capability number. And so this is really forcing you to balance those plans and get that lined up. And then the final piece of that, which is that other buffer that's there, is at the bottom, which is inventory, right? And so this is really forcing me to say, get that story together that's balanced, that, as I said before, goes from point A to point B.
So I thought about this in the context of somebody we were just talking to that's a 100% project business. It's not exactly a job shop, but maybe 5 different major sub assemblies that get configured in different ways into projects. There's no
Yeah.
project that's the same. Every project requires some engineering. And so I think it's important for people to realize it's not just building widgets. It's this sort of data. It's really important for 100% project based ETO or
Yeah.
whatever you mean by project based. And in
And
this case, it's really not ETO, but it's high end CTO with some engineers involved. But
and it's I would say in many ways it's hugely important for the project business, because
sure,
one of the challenges on projects are, so you've got, typically a project's going to have a combination of material, but it also may have engineering hours and stuff like that. Well, material I can inventory, right?
Mhm.
Engineering hours I can't, right?
Right,
So and they may be, so when I look at the buffer on my engineering hours, like what is my, I've got to know what my capacity and what can I do. But if I look at engineering hours, it's like, man, I want to know what that load is going forward, which, by the way, that load for engineering is your backlog. What do I currently have in my backlog? And then what am I expecting to add on to it? So a whole nother topic, which at some
yeah,
point at the time I think we're going to do, is that synchronization in the project type of business, because it is very important. I think I mean, I run a project business, so I think
right.
it's incredibly
So
important
do
for
I.
me. So yeah, exactly. So yeah, on that side, pretty important. Yeah.
And I think that also kind of helps people understand that when we talk about units, that's not necessarily the unit that everybody needs. It translates in the unit everybody needs.
Right.
So engineering
Right.
hours is probably not going to be the unit that this particular company would use, because their common unit that works pretty well for all the families is power units. How much
Yeah.
power are we going to create in somebody's solution, which is kind of a little different than what most people think. And I would say 90% of our clients, it is a unit, like an item is what we're talking
Yeah.
about, like making one thing in that family. But that's still got to translate into all sorts of stuff: manpower, shift hours, whatever it takes to
Yeah.
run to produce. So
Yeah, I always go, we always say, you should never do it this way, but there are some times where that is the way. But I would say the common unit's got to translate across all of those.
yeah,
And sales dollars is not typically that one. But I can tell you, in some projects, mine, for example,
yeah,
we actually use dollars as our S&OP, because I've got a translation back into load so I can see that. And that's
and that
just
works because you really have fairly homogenous pricing. Software licenses
right,
to license it.
right,
Yeah, so
right. Yeah, exactly. So that was really the story side of things. So I'll use the 5 section sheet again, and we'll just talk about accountability, right? So, because this is such an important thing. And I'm going to use the bookings piece. And normally I'd be looking at this at a level below the 5 section sheet to the demand stream. So, but I'm going to, just for the purpose of this, I'm going to say, in terms of accountability for the overall bookings, we have somebody who's accountable for the plan. So how does the data support that accountability? Well, if I look at it, I'll focus really on this gray column, right? So I have my actual bookings right here, right? So it's about 6,500 units is what we booked. Now, remember, when we looked at the 5-section sheet, the actual shipments were around 4,000 units. So we actually booked more than what we really, if we're thinking of driving the backlog down. But more importantly, if I look at this, is I've got a 1 month previous plan, right? So you can see that 1 month previous plan, which is right here, and we actually blew the doors off of what our 1 month previous plan was, right? We're like 3 times as much. And so the accountability for bookings clearly lies with sales, right? So we totally missed on the forecast because we there was something that with current customers, or something happened in there that was completely unexpected, right? And so that's part of this. So we establish a bandwidth, right? That we say, hey, if you're within this bandwidth, great. But in this case, bandwidth is here. You actually booked way out here. There's got to be an answer for that, right? Like, what happened that we didn't expect to happen? And it's really, the accountability piece is so important, and that's what we drive to. And so at the end of every month, we capture the actual data, and then you compare that to what you just did. And that should be happening in the demand meeting on the demand side, should be happening in the supply meeting on the pre-S&OP supply, because we're looking for the answer for what happened, so that we can, as we go into the next month, we can say, well, what assumptions did we make that drove us to that number? And should we make those same assumptions? If I blew it out by 3 times as much, I probably want to question my assumptions, or what the heck is going on in the marketplace, right?
Yeah, you can miss above or below. And I think we should also point out that you really want to capture that data about the same day every month. So you're getting the
Yeah.
same kind of window. And that depends on how long it takes for it to trickle into your system, or wherever you track it. But that's important.
What's very important about it is that you capture, if I look down the sheet, bookings, shipments, inventory, backlog, and production. You need to capture that all at the same time, because if
Yeah,
you think about it,
won't be
things
synced.
move. They move from different parts of the plan, and so
Won't be balanced. Yeah.
right. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to figure out math and then realizing, oh, yeah, we had a week lag on how we pulled the data. Wow, that doesn't work so well. So, good point. I didn't actually say that in terms of the data, but yes, you need to capture all of that at the same time. So accountability is going back and looking at what happened. And maybe just one final point on this one. If you just go back to the screen, Marshall, one of the things that we do, and it's going to be hard to see on here, because this is the classic waterfall. This was the last plan. Let me go back one. This was the last plan, and this is the current plan going forward. So I can see how much I'm changing it, and I can see here what just happened. One of the things that we do in the 5-section sheet is we always hold the 1 month prior. So when I'm looking historically, right now I'm only looking at 1 month, but if I was to blow this out and look at like 6 months past, we always hold the 1 month prior number, so that you can see, going back, how well did we do historically, right? How well did we do on calling our bookings, our production, all going back? Because that's all about the accountability in the organization to say, wow, did we, how good are we at 1 month calling out? People go, oh, let's do the M-3. You know what? Get the M-1 right first. Then you can worry about the M-3, right? So,
Yes.
that's, to me, that's a pretty important one. So that's about all I wanted to say on accountability. Unless there's any other questions or observations you might have to add, Marshall.
No, the only thing I would mention is that Beza uses DBM for all of our S&OP, because these thought leadership type categories of how S&OP is executed. But what we're looking at are actually screenshots of the 5-section sheet, which is a software product. It can be implemented. The concepts can be implemented in Excel. Obviously, that's what it kind of looks like. But DBM has an S&OP product that we use, and it's excellent. And the reason it's excellent is things like, month -1 versus month -3, all that stuff gets handled, in a database, and you can easily roll months and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah.
if it seems daunting to look at rolling months in and out and that kind of, it is if you're using Excel, but it's not necessary to necessarily roll everything. You can just focus on 1 month past and
Yeah.
12 months forward.
Yeah. So I know, good point. Good point. So let's flip to the next piece, which is thinking about data and how does it support the risk assessment. And so the way I think about risk is, there's always the question of what's happened, but then what do we think's going to happen? And if I see a vast difference from, what's happened in the past and what we're planning in the future, that always kind of brings a, idea of risk. So, oops, I went the wrong way here. So remember what I said here. Everything going forward is a future plan. This is as if we just finished, we're in the March S&OP. We just finished February. I've got my future plans and I've got my plans in history. And so when you look at this, I kind of see a step change in March from February, right? Like I actually booked 6,500 units in February, and I'm only planning on booking 1,000 units in March. And so I would kind of say, what's going on here? Did all my salespeople, are they taking holidays because we had such a great February and nobody's going to be booking orders? What's going on here? And so part of this, it's kind of that litmus test on what do we expect to happen? And so we use these, right, the past and the future going forward. The one I watch a lot on this is production, right? Especially when you're in kind of a constraining mode where you're right up against your capacity and production wants to put a plan in there that's going to meet the sales plan. And it's like, 2x what the old plan was. And you're like, wait a second, what's going to change, right? Or if I look at the forecast and, we have a customer forecast and we've been here, but the next one is like way up here. It's like the world usually doesn't shift that quickly that we kind of know about it, right? I mean, stuff does happen, but
Yeah.
at the same token, right? It's those are
There's usually wishful thinking, or there's some sort of management pressure to do, hit a financial plan or something that's
yeah.
making it a little.
Yep. So that's one that's a check. And if I see those, if I'm coaching executives through this, I would just say, I think you want to dig into this. Are they telling you what they think you want to hear that gets you to your plan? Or are they telling you, wait a second, this is what's actually going to happen?
And why?
And why? And part of that is, and that's why looking back at that history, like if you start to see a bias, production is consistently overstating what they're going to produce in the next month. And consistently we're coming underneath that. Then it's like, wait a second, guys, we actually need to realize, where we're at, right? And that's such a goes the risk assessment drives with the accountability, right?
Sure.
So the other piece that I look at on that and if you just flip back for 1 second, Marshall, you can leave us on the bottom if you want because there's a lot of real estate there. But I'm coaching the director. How's that?
No problem. I like coaching.
Yeah, there you go. But one of the other ones that I think is important, and we've actually added to it since I grabbed these screenshots, but we use two numbers: current year expected and year to date is what we've always used. And so the question always is, as you get through the year, right? Current year expected is what's going to get me to the end of my fiscal year. We're always looking at that fiscal year based on historical plus the plan going forward. So, for example, if I'm sitting here and it's March in this case, I've really got January and February in my historical, and the rest is a forecast. But as I get through the year, right, the amount that is in my year to date is going to get larger, and my current year expected is going to, it's a good way for me to check because I don't know if you've ever seen this, Marshall, but it's like we're always going to make the year up in the last quarter, right?
For the quarter and the
Yeah, exactly. So or the quarter in the last week or the last month, right?
Yeah.
And so this is really forcing you to do one of those checks to say, is that really what's going to happen? The one that we've added to this is the concept of a rolling 12 going forward. And so the nice part about that rolling 12 is that you can think about current year expected, which is very much focused on my fiscal year. But that rolling 12 is always going forward, the rolling 12. And so what it's basically saying is, as I look, beyond my year, am I actually calling for sales or sorry, shipments or bookings or production to be going up or down? And that's a really important one because often the decisions that we have to make, some of the longer term decisions, will be outside of the current fiscal year.
Yes.
So those are a couple of the things that I think are pretty important on the risk assessment side. I put this in. It's probably a bit of an eye chart, but for those that are looking at it, it was just this idea because I talked about risk assessment and I talked about the story and I talked about accountability. I just thought I'd put this in here. So I don't want to go through all this, but you can see these are the pieces of data that we're looking for, right? So bookings, shipments, and so if I look across here, maybe I'll just go across the row. So I got bookings, and then I've got my actuals, right? And this is a definition of that. Then what is my future plan? And then what's the granularity that I look at this? So you can see this, the I'll call it the demand side of the picture is at the demand stream level. And if you're not sure what demand streams are, Marshall, you can, I forget which one it was that we've done, but we've talked about this in multiple live streams. So maybe go back and check that out. Or there's an article either up on Beza or our website that will talk about the importance of demand streams. And then what is the accountability for that? So these top two are sales. The actual constrained shipment plan and your backlog plan is really an output of the process, right? Because this is what you're arriving at is a constrained shipment plan. And then you can see capability and you can see the supply and the inventory. So if you want that to just have that, you can take a little screenshot of what's on my screen.
Well, I'll get it on the description. So
Yeah,
we'll provide a link for y'all in the recorded version.
perfect,
If not,
perfect.
maybe we can get somebody to drop it in here. But
Yeah,
the I just want to remind everybody that we do have an S&OP assessment that helps with all of these types of ideas that you can take. And so the stuff that we're talking about that is best practice S&OP is all looked at. You answer, I don't know, 10 minutes of questions. What do you think, Doug?
yeah. It's less than 10 minutes. Yeah,
Okay, so less than 10 minutes.
the reading after you're done
Yeah.
is more than 10 minutes. But
Yeah, we're pretty good with the diagnostics on a small number of questions, but the prescriptions can be weighty, but in a good way. You're going to have really well-defined prescriptions
yeah,
prioritized. So, what do you look at first, second, third, based on scoring and that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So,
I, I think in terms of data, that's kind of what I wanted to cover. I did
yeah,
do one final slide, which is just going back to this whole idea of telling the story, right? And I think that is it for me. That's what it comes down to, right? You have to live where you are, right? And where I am is the reality of first of all, what happened last month, right? And then I put it against what did I think was going to happen, it's just so important to capture that. What do I think is going to happen? At the beginning of the month, because so many things are going to happen, and you're going to find that early on, it's often very surprising for a lot of companies where some of the volatility ends up or where some of the misses are. And really what it does is it forces you to address that. And the one that I see many times, everyone wants to focus on their demand signal, but the ability and this is this, so don't feel bad if you're in this situation, but the reality is that many companies are sitting with a lot of backlog. more backlog than 1 month's worth of shipments or production capability, and yet they are failing to meet what they plan to do on a production standpoint coming into the month. So it means
Double whammy.
I got lots of orders, but I'm not actually planning well enough in that first month to execute those orders. And that, I know we'll have supply chain issues, all those sort of things that happen.
Yeah.
But what happens for a lot of organizations is what I call churn in the first month. Is we're so busy chasing priorities that we don't meet the plan. And the challenge with chasing priorities is it hits you on production efficiency, right? Like it's that's a big one, right? And so when that starts to happen, then and it hits you on inventory because I get everything to the line all ready to produce something, and then I'm going to move and do something else. Well, now I got inventory sitting there. I can't necessarily track it. Like it's just, and so part of this is getting you to the point of really taking control of the business, which is the mantra that we've used many, many times in this. Like S&OP is the story of where you are, but it's about taking control of the business. Well, you can't take control of the business until you kind of know what the problems are. And that's what this has got to show. So hopefully that was helpful.
That was really helpful. And I do think of it as, things are happening around you. Some of those things are happening to you, but you also have things you're trying to do. And that all gets recorded in an S&OP, a healthy S&OP process. It's a way over generalization, but you really kind of, in most organizations, the next 3 months are kind of baked in. So thrashing around in those 3 months is usually a bad idea at some level. It's got to be done at some level as well.
Yeah.
But, and I know every business is different, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but
right.
Really S&OP is about planning the next year.
Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting. I mean, you've heard me say it, right? It's the illusion of flexibility. We've got to stay, but you actually have to plan for flexibility, right?
Yeah.
The illusion of right. The illusion of flexibility is saying, hey, we're the most flexible people and we just want to take order. Well, you've actually got to plan for that. And if you want to be flexible and your production capability is 1,000 units a day, you better not actually plan to build 1,000 units a day. Right? Because if you plan to build 1,000 units a day, the math doesn't work. Right. Yeah. There is no room for flexibility. And if you're going to fill that all with backlog, anyways, I digress. But
the story of the business gets very comprehensive the more we think about it. So
that's right.
Well, good stuff. So today was data, required data, and next week will be the 8th piece of our series on what does good look like. And what is that, Doug?
We're going to talk about measurements, which is great.
So you got data. Now we're going to talk about how we measure, and that'll be a week from today, the 15th of December, 2022. Hope to see you then.
All right. Take care, Marshall.
Thank you.